Welcome to The Builders, a Postgres podcast. I am your host Gulcin Yildirim Jelinek. In each episode, we bring you a deep dive into Postgres technologies and their real-world applications with a distinguished guest. Get ready for another insightful journey through the intersection of Postgres, data, and AI. Let's dive in. Hello, welcome, Tomas. Today, you are my guest for the Builders podcast. How are you?
Hi. I'm quite well, thank you.
For the people in the audience, I know Tomas for how many years now? For 8 years, maybe more. And we have been colleagues in two different companies and over maybe 4 offices we shared together so far. We had a meetup going on, Prague Postgres meetup, and we want to actually revive it this year, hopefully. We gave a break between the COVID time and just didn't come back to it yet. And yeah, he's a close friend of mine and also my colleague. So happy to introduce him to you through this episode today. Tomas, can you also introduce yourself a little bit for the people who don't know you for 8 years?
I can try, definitely. So I'm Tomas Vondra. I live in Prague for many years. I am a Postgres contributor, developer for a couple of years. I'm also a committer. I first joined a Postgres company called Second Quadrant. I think it was like 2015, after working on Postgres for many years. Since then, I also worked for Enterprise DB, which is where I work right now, and still working on Postgres on different features, different problems.
So as we are both Postgres people, and I would like to start the discussion today with how do you see Postgres evolve, and do you foresee any technical challenges, maybe major challenges in the design or in the Postgres itself as a whole product?
Yeah, sure. I think there are actually many challenges Postgres has to deal with. It's a database that has like a 30-year history, I think, roughly. And there's a lot of baggage that comes with that. I mean, like each product evolves, right? Is designed in a certain way with respect to the resources available at that time. That's not just like technical resources, the hardware that was like available 30 years ago, which is like completely different in many respects from the hardware that we have now. Just the number of CPU cores or like the amount of memory and different types of storage and so on. There's like that changes how the database needs to work. And Postgres needs to adapt to that. But I think there are also cultural problems or like problems with like the number of developers working on the project and so on. And also with problems with how Postgres interacts with the users. I mean, like as a project or as a product. Postgres was always, at least in my opinion, extremely flexible, extremely extensible, which is great for like system builders, but maybe not great for users who do expect like ready-made solution. There is like natural tension between those two things. And I think Postgres will need to deal with that somehow. I'm not sure exactly how that looks, how that will look in the future, but I think it's one of the things users often approach me. You do not, because we do not have built-in solutions for a lot of things, right? And we expect the external tools to do a lot of stuff. But maybe users do not actually desire that, right? They want something they can actually use right away.
Yeah, it's true. Like, I think that Postgres itself, when I started as well, it seemed like really cool technology. It still is, but it depended on a lot of how people can actually configure it, manage it. And it felt like this hackery vibe, right? Versus there were other projects that they were just like out of the box and users felt more convenient. I don't want to name names. But yeah, for Postgres was from the beginning, I think it maybe didn't cater towards the generic user and estimated people to have some level of technical depth. It doesn't need to be too high, but some sort of knowledge prior. And to learn around it, like, as you say, like we don't have a backup solution natively, for example, right? And people expect maybe that's much simpler differently. And the users nowadays, they didn't probably experience how it was before. And it's much easier for the rest of the tools in the cloud and the microservices and the platforms that are like oriented for these purposes. So many things are abstracted away, while maybe for Postgres, we still need to know more if you are not using a solution that is like using Postgres underneath.
I think that's exactly what I've been talking about. Essentially, people or like end users expecting like ready-made solutions, but Postgres providing more like the building blocks, right? I don't think that we should remove this. I think like the extensibility was one of the main advantages of Postgres, because you can do like so many cool things with it. And when we are working on like internals on Postgres itself, we always try to make it like extensible in ways that we don't even expect, which allows to all kinds of stuff in situations that we haven't anticipated. I don't think we can remove this without essentially killing Postgres, because extensibility is such important part of that. And it also means important not just for technical product, but also for the community as a whole, because it essentially allows different customers or different companies to use Postgres in completely different ways, right? Not just in the way that one entity developing Postgres kind of like approves. So I think that's perfectly fine, perfectly healthy. I'm sure there are things that we can and we should improve in maybe packaging some of that into Postgres itself. I mean, like still allow the extensible external tools to work, make it maybe easier, or at least like easier to discover the ready-made solutions.
Environments, basically, people might have, we can maybe suggest stuff that you can use this and that for these purposes and this and that for that purposes. Of course, as I think you are right, as a whole project, assuming one type of workload or one type of use case and providing a solution for that would be almost impossible. And given the, as you say, history of Postgres and how extensibility is a big thing about it. Even like when you think about it, like, okay, let's have a solution, let's say, as we were saying, for backups. To what extent, how can we cater to all this audience that using Postgres in many different ways? There's an opportunity to make things better, maybe offer a sort of generic solution for maybe generic problems. And I think Postgres is doing very well, actually, addressing this kind of use cases. But there will be always things that we might not estimate, and we can't really provide something specially. So it's another way of it, like technically or also business-wise.
So I think you mentioned backups, and I think that's actually quite interesting and good example of the extensibility, right? Because Postgres has like multiple ways to do backups, and also there are different tools, different products to do backups on Postgres. Because Postgres allows you to do some basic types of backups, like you can do essentially a snapshot of the database, either by dumping the data into a logical format, pgdump, or you can do a physical backup using pg-based backup, which is then useful for physical replication. But it doesn't actually provide any advanced features, a catalog of the backups or this sort of stuff. So there are multiple tools built on physical backup, on top of like base backup and so on, to provide these features. And I think the typical example is either Barman or PG Backrest. And I did work for a company for a second quadrant, which was developing the Barman. And I think it works perfectly fine in many cases. But I'm also, as a member of the community, I'm also happy that we have PG Backrest, because it actually works in many situations where Barman actually doesn't work quite well. It's like in extremely large databases and cloud environments and so on. I think the PG Backrest is like a better solution. And that's not a fault of PG Barman. It's just like the admission that there are different use cases. Different use cases require different tools. So, and I think this is exactly what made Postgres possible, or like what made Postgres so successful. It's so flexible, it actually can support both of these tools. And developers of all the tools have exactly the same position, right? Because they can contribute stuff into Postgres. There's not like one company deciding what is important, what is not. Each of the external tools can do roughly the same thing. And I think that's great. I think that's a very healthy environment. And also it doesn't mean that we do not improve backups in Postgres itself, right? I think it's just like, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks ago, we committed like incremental backups where we would allow to do backups more efficient. It was possible to do something like that even before using like rsync and so on, or file system level snapshots, something like that. Now we will have some support and arguably a better support built into Postgres itself. And again, it's a feature that will be available to all the external tools, right? So they will be able to leverage that some. What we just described, or what I just described for backups, I think you could talk about like many different parts of Postgres with the same idea of extensibility, right? Like logical replication, for example, or all kinds of like user-defined objects.
Yeah, like it makes the environment definitely healthy and inclusive. I agree with you. Like there are tools that can work with Postgres and they work with different things. And when one project started, maybe that use case was not even, existing, and the design choice for that was meant that way. And I remember when we were developing database as a service, when we were working with second quadrant, Barman was not quite up par with the cloud integrations. I remember using at that time Wall G or Wall E. I think there was another solution like that. I don't know if it still exists, the project. And it's really good because there's always something that you can actually adjust. And if not, you can actually build your own thing. And while Postgres core is developing features that supports these tools, you can also use it around it and do your thing. And it's the biggest selling point in Postgres, in my opinion. Okay, so we're trying to talk about technical challenges and difficulties, but now we ended up actually promoting Postgres because it's like how it is. So anything about, I maybe can ask you questions like, what do you think in the upcoming challenges that we see, like multi-threading and process versus, multi-threading model? Do you want to say about a few things about it?
Right. So I think if we are talking about like the technical challenges, the most important ones that would require like significant shift in how Postgres actually works, I do think it's the multi-threading and also the asynchronous I/O or like direct I/O work Andres Freund is currently working on it, and like the whole Microsoft team, I think, is working on. Both of these changes are very closely related to the hardware changes, right? 10, 15 years ago, maybe we had like a couple cores in the machines, and we probably still had the traditional hard drives and so on. Nowadays, we have maybe on the higher end a couple hundred CPU cores in the bigger machines. We have like super fast storage systems based on flash storage and so on. These things require significant changes in how the database works internally, simply because some of the timings change so much that it's no longer true that storage is much slower than memory. The relationship is completely different. So I think we have already heard the proposal to switch to multi-threading years ago, and it's even more important now to consider like what would it require. But I think it's going to be challenging because the process-based model with like a single process per user connection it affects so much of the design of Postgres that it will require a lot of changes. And I think it's definitely doable. I think we definitely do have the people capable of switching the code base to threads. It will definitely require some architectural changes, but that's kind of why we are doing that. That's kind of the goal, to change the architecture. And it will need to happen in smaller steps over multiple releases, probably. I think the bigger challenge is like exactly the impact on the external tools, right? On extensions that often are written in C and do actually expect the design, the architecture to be process-based. So I think it's going to be quite challenging not to disrupt everything else, even with extensions that maybe didn't really change very much for a couple of years. Now it will require some changes, possibly quite significant ones in them. I think it will be important to make the change, if it even happens, in a way that is not too disruptive to the wider ecosystem. That's my concern, because I think on the technical side, I think we definitely do have the people able to do that switch. I think the most recent proposal was from Heikki, and I think he's perfectly capable of doing this. Maybe not alone, but he has a couple other people in his team at Neon who are actually able to do that. So there was the multi-threading. I think it perfectly makes sense. Maybe even, multi-threading is maybe not ambitious enough, because some of the most performant databases actually do not even use multi-threading. They use like cooperative multitasking to make the switches between the tasks even cheaper, because that's super important to minimize the overhead of switching. switching between tasks, especially if you want to saturate the storage. For the other task, which is the asynchronous I/O, the direct I/O, I think it's a similar thing, except that it doesn't really change the external API of Postgres very much. I mean, it doesn't really change how extensions, for example, work with Postgres. Maybe the disruption is a bit more contained to Postgres itself. It's a very useful, mental exercise, because a lot of these things are actually things that we should have done anyway, even if we stay on a process-based model. But it wasn't necessary. Just considering the switch to thread-based model or something else makes those design deficiencies much more obvious. And I'm thinking, for example, about using global variables in different modules, which is perfectly fine when the global variable is confined to a single process, right, which is running a single connection. But it immediately breaks when the process can be used by different tasks. But it's also a bit incorrect, or we shouldn't be using global variables like this. I think it's a good thing that we are being forced to change this, to improve this. Two bigger technical challenges, I think, I see. Obviously, there are many smaller challenges or problems that maybe I do not appreciate enough. Those are the two most important ones, the largest problems. And then there are, of course, the two other areas. One is the cultural, which is about what Postgres offers, which is the extensibility, and what users expect, which is ready-made solutions. And we already briefly discussed about that. And then there's also the last thing. I think that's generally the problem of sustaining the project in having enough developers to actually do this stuff. Because if you look at how many developers do work on Postgres itself, and how many features are being delivered every year, it doesn't change very much. And also the question is do we actually get enough new contributors and so on? I'm not sure what exactly is the current state, if it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's difficult to give opinions on this because I've been a member of the community for so long, right? It's I essentially started working with Postgres 20 years ago, and for maybe 15 years, I'm contributing smaller patches, and eventually I became a committer. So whatever I say is essentially going to be affected by survivor bias, right? Because I stuck with the community. So I have very little experience with how it actually is to join the community now, right? How it is for new contributors. I'm pretty sure that the bar is only increasing. It's the patches that I submitted at the beginning, I'm sure it would be much harder to get them into Postgres now. The expectation of the quality of contributions is probably much higher. And also that's caused partially by the project becoming so successful and so popular, right? So we are trying to improve the engineering practice to make sure that bugs happen as infrequently as possible. But that also means that getting some simple patches is becoming harder. And also it means that a lot of the simple improvements have already been made, right? So it's difficult for new contributors to find a good first patch. And then also when they have an idea, to actually get some useful feedback on that, to maybe even get it into Postgres, get it committed. So for new contributors, it's super, super difficult, I think, especially because they have very little. It's difficult to say if something that seems simple actually is simple to do, or if it's even feasible. Because you can have a very simple idea that looks simple, but ultimately would need to interact with a lot of things in Postgres, which is probably not a good idea for new contributors. I don't know how it will work, but I've started working on a half-a-day workshop that gives people the first set of information that they need to actually start contributing to Postgres. And that's not necessarily about how to write code, but mostly about how the community works, right? How to actually submit a patch, how to do reviews, or how this whole thing actually works, what tools are available, how to submit a patch into a commit fest, what it actually is a commit fest, things like that. And I had my first run of this workshop, I think like 2 months ago at a local conference. I think it went quite well, even though I didn't have like immediate response from people starting to work on Postgres because of that. But I think it's a long-term process. I'm sure I need to improve the workshop. If there is someone who wants to either attend such workshop or like invite me to speak at a local conference, I'm happy to do that. But I also started kind of like collecting patch ideas that I think would be a good idea to do and would also be sufficiently small and sufficiently accessible to new contributors. Right? So, for example, not touching too large part of the code base or like too many modules, right? So kind of like isolated in smaller parts of the code.
That's actually a great idea. So you actually cover onboarding from both sides, like how to onboard people to the maybe easier patches as first patches, and also make sure that we are actually getting features that are needed. And you kind of match this. I think it's because I think new developers, from what I see, ends up in either like newer tech that is like easier to be getting into, is less scary maybe to just jump into a project that are just starting, or in turn when it comes to Postgres, I see that there's a tendency to become extension developer or part of a company that works on an extension using like for Postgres, or a fork of Postgres. So it's probably easier for people to join that side because there are more mentors maybe available directly in their companies that they work, or there's a goal that company supports and pays them. What you do is actually extremely important for the community, like mentoring people who actually wants to contribute directly to Postgres. Although it can, of course, include, again, the environmental like tools and extensions and everything, but like giving and how to, I think we really have to do better there.
So I don't think any of the things that you mentioned, like working on extension or working not necessarily on Postgres directly, but on like a fork of Postgres I don't think that's a bad thing, because that means you are getting familiar with the Postgres code. And also it means that if you are working on a fork, it means that you are actually paid for working on Postgres code, right? Which I think it's like the most important part to make it a sustainable project, to actually the people to be paid for working on it, because you can only do like volunteer work for some limited amount of time. I think that's super important, or like if those things work for the person, cool. I don't have a problem with forks, and I think Postgres has a super successful relationship with forks. I mean, like there are many forks of Postgres, but essentially all of them are still part of the wider community. Even products based on Postgres the people working on them are still attending Postgres conferences, are like contributing patches. And that's also related to the extensibility of Postgres, right? Because it's much easier to develop like fork when the underlying project is still kind of like helping you to keep the separation clean through an API instead of, diverging and then never getting any upstream features. And there are many such projects that are successful on their own, but also contributing important features or back to Postgres. So I'm fine with that. I think I'm more...
Yeah. I didn't want to frame it in a way that, is a negative thing, but as an observation to like easier maybe for people to just join it that way. But it's a great point that these projects are not alienating themselves much and still feeding into the core Postgres.
I think it's super interesting that Postgres, which has a BSD license essentially, which is like super friendly to forking, right? You can essentially just do a fork and go on and develop your own project like completely independently. I think it's super interesting that the successful forks that actually survive and so on, they are still very closely related to the community. And I think it's great, actually, success of the community in general, that this works.
Also, like now that we talk, I remember another maybe advantage of it, the way that the forks and the other projects work, I knew that PG Logical as an extension, for example, brought many features back to the logical replication to Postgres. And that is one thing that I knew it because I had used it and have give talks about it, and I could see the progress. And it also, maybe at the time when Postgres is not able to change whole design to support a feature, but there's already a fork or a tool or an extension doing it, that also maybe reduces the time to test this, that if this idea is feasible, as you say, maybe it will not, and it will just die off, and maybe it will bring great features like logical replication to it, even though it starts as an extension, like some external solution using Postgres. So it's a very, very, very good perspective you put in this for me now. I definitely appreciate this.
I think you mentioned PG Logical. I think that's a great example of this, because it was a great source of experience from the field, because extensions in general allow innovation to happen kind of much faster, right? Because you can deliver the improvements to customers much more frequently than once a year, which is essentially what Postgres as the database does. Once you get something into Postgres core, you are at any moment essentially at least 18 months from delivering that to your customers, because you need a bit of time for development, and then it's likely that if you commit something right now, it's not going to be in Postgres release until September, right? Extensions are a great tool to address this, right? Because you can then deliver stuff to customers much faster, and you can also get the experience with running that in much faster. And based on that, you can improve the contributions back to Postgres significantly.
Okay, so I know we discussed generically about Postgres, but I think people might be wondering what were the projects that you were working on, what were the features that we were working in Postgres developments. Anything you would like to mention, perhaps briefly?
This is always a difficult question for me, because I'm working on a lot of things, and also because I work on patches, I always work on stuff that is going to be in Postgres in a year. I never have a very good idea what already was committed in the current version of Postgres. What I was involved in last year.
I remember generically, I can give you a few pointers that I know that you were working. There were these Brin index improvements, perhaps. Great statistics, I know. Maybe data corruption. I know that you are a performance guy as well. Replication, maybe some features with it. Monitoring. I don't know. I'm sure I forgot some things, but yeah, these are the things that comes to my mind when I think of your contribution.
So I think you do actually remember more things than I do. So
a fan.
Nothing to apologize for. But yes, brain indexes in general are something that I worked on and also was speaking about at conferences quite a bit, because I think it's underappreciated feature in Postgres and maybe underdeveloped. So I've been working on improvements both in Postgres in past releases and also in Postgres 17, I think there will be parallel index creation and stuff like that. And also various optimizations that I've been helping with. And also a bunch of bug fixes for annoying bugs in indexes. That's definitely true. I've been also, extended statistics is probably one of the larger patches that I've been working on, not necessarily by the amount of the code, but also because it affects the optimizer, right? Which is such a central part of the database, an important part for performance and getting the correct plans. And there's still a lot of room for improvement, because the query planning is, especially for complex data sets, so many things that can go wrong.
Okay, so maybe we just talked a lot about extensibility of Postgres, and maybe you like to share some of the interesting and innovative extensions that you like in Postgres, that you either maybe perhaps contributed to, or you are using mainly, or just something you find it cool.
Yes, so I think over the years I developed, I don't know, 40 extensions, mostly experimental ones, and none of them are, I think, important enough to mention. Those were like interesting projects and more an illustration to the usefulness of extensions as like a playground that you can actually quickly try stuff from outside Postgres. So some of them are useful, some of them have been superseded by feature added to Postgres and so on. But there are definitely like extensions that are super important for the community as a whole, or for like users, and give them capabilities that are not available in Postgres itself. I think I have like 3 or 4 types of extensions on like a small list. Some of them are essentially building like a completely new database product on top of Postgres, right? And some of them are more about providing features that are
missing in
Postgres. Maybe missing in Postgres itself. I think for the most well-known database like on Postgres extensions, I think I need to mention Citus and Timescale. Those are like super interesting for use cases that are maybe not as well supported in Postgres itself as they should be. And that's like sharding and time series data, which is kind of like useful capability in both cases. And a lot of these features actually improved in Postgres itself, but the extensions still exist and I think will not disappear. And then there are a couple extensions that I think are super interesting for people who already are using Postgres, but would like to extend it in some way. And I think the largest and like most important extension in this space is like Postgres, right? Which is giving like geospatial capabilities to Postgres, like super useful if you are doing, if you need to do something with maps and routing between places with this kind of stuff. There is essentially a whole separate community around Postgres with like separate conferences, but also because they are essentially in the geospatial use case, not necessarily a database, very useful exchange of ideas between those two, between Postgres and Postgres. And then, of course, I have to mention pgvector, which is, AI is like a new hot thing. And Postgres, of course, allows storing the embeddings and all that stuff. And pgvector is a useful extension to do that in the Postgres database. I'm not saying this means that like the vector and specialized databases are dead. Absolutely not. There are many like limitations of the pgvector or doing stuff in Postgres. But if you already have stuff in Postgres and you just need to extend that to pgvector to also support like AI vector searches, I think it's a great tool. And I have absolutely no doubt that it will make massive improvements in the future, the extension, I mean. I think it's something I would like to actually start working on, at least get more familiar with, because there are many improvements possible. And then I also have the extension called pgrunga on my list, which is Postgres has like full text search built in.
What's the name again, Tomas?
pgrunga.
Okay.
Runga,
like
yeah.
RAM index kind of?
No. pgroonga.
Okay.
pgrunga. Yeah.
Okay.
Which is essentially like a full text search on top of Postgres, but better user experience, handling some of the stuff in a more flexible way, like multiple languages and so on. Of course, it's still using the indexing and all of that in Postgres, but maybe a good example of the ready-made product versus the building blocks available in Postgres itself. That's another extension. And also the last one I have here is like Postgres, which is like RESTful.
For RESTful.
Yeah, RESTful API on top of Postgres, which I think is very useful for some use cases when you just need to access the database in this way. This can actually be very useful. Yes.
This is cool. I learned 2 new extensions that I didn't hear before. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, if people want to look at like at which extensions are like super popular or like the most useful or so on, I suggest they look at like extensions supported by database as a service companies, right?
Yeah.
Because they usually do support stuff that people actually do need. So that's very, very useful.
Good idea, actually. Yeah, because they really need to add stuff that people want to use. Yeah, make sure
Yes.
that, yeah, good idea. Okay. And I also, before we really end the episode, want you to talk a little bit about the performance aspect of Postgres. And I know you from like both in the company and previous companies and also in Postgres work with the benchmarks and you prepare them and you measure the, I don't know, performance of different things and scalability of things. And maybe you can just mention a little bit of those work you do too. I think it's the kind of important aspect of your career as well.
First of all, I'd like to make it clear that I'm working like benchmarking and not benchmarking. I'm doing benchmarks primarily to learn something about the database, right? To
Right.
learn instead of doing like promotions or whatever. I do quite a bit of benchmarks, and I also sometimes like present them at conferences, more like I did this benchmark, these are the results that I found, these are the interesting learnings, conclusions from that. I think it's a great way to learn about the internals of the database because, or any other product, because it forces you to kind of like first formulate what your expectations are based on kind of like your mental model of how the database works, or like what kind of performance should you get, certain workload, and then you can actually compare that to what you actually saw, right? And if you see something that matches your expectations, cool, your understanding of how the database works seems to be in line with what already happens. Sometimes you actually run into unexpected misbehavior, right? It's like the performance is much lower or something like that. And then either you learn something about the database, something you didn't know before, or you actually find something that can be significantly improved. You notice that there's like a locking issue, for example, something,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or you actually do hit a bug in something. Then that's a good thing, allows actually to improve the database. So that's why I do benchmarking. I don't have any like great suggestions what to benchmark and so on.
Essentially, you use it as to first get into the problems, perhaps, that might affect stuff, or to see the impact of
Yes.
some change and how that workload might perform if that change didn't happen, positive or negative. Maybe you just like, yeah, it's like, okay. And because when people think about, I understand your point, like benchmarks, it can be really like, yeah, tweaked into a solution that shows really great results and can be used for maybe a purpose that, or a motive behind it with marketing, as you say. But I know that you do it a lot, and I was actually, I wanted to ask you like and the content of it. And do you use
Right.
PG Bench only, or are other what kind of performance tools like that you are using for benchmarking?
I definitely do use PG Bench. I do that mostly because a lot of the benchmarking that I do is essentially part of the batch development on the mailing list, right? So I either do evaluations of patches submitted by others, and then I try to kind of like get a better idea of how their patch works, or I do that for my patches, trying to demonstrate like what are the benefits and also what are the risks of each patch, right? And because it then helps with evaluating the trade-offs of the different patches. But I definitely do use PG Bench. I think it's a very useful tool to drive the benchmark. But of course, I use like custom scripting and so on. In various cases, I also use like a custom, scripts, or like not PG Bench, but say Bash scripts or whatever. That's when I need to do like a more complex workload than just simple PG Bench, or like simple set of SQL scripts or something. In those cases, it's definitely not PG Bench. I don't have any like particular tool that I would use. And also for like benchmarking of the database, when you need to show the performance to someone else, it might be useful to use an established tool. Like for example, one of the TPC benchmarks, or the open source tooling implementing them, or something like that. But I don't think I do that very often.
Okay. I got it. I think it makes sense, like the way that you described, and also coming from a committer perspective, that like if something needs to be added, it needs to bring more benefit than maybe negative impact to the whole thing, whole Postgres. And then I can understand why you actually do it often now. we are almost at the end, and I wanted to finish it on a happier note. And do you have anything that you can share with us that is like you witnessed during your career, like maybe a production failure or a big mistake or something that you look back at now and find it funny in a way? Now that like time passed over it, anything that you want to share with us, the audience?
I'm sure I saw like funny accidents, even though it didn't seem funny at the time, right? Because it usually involves like a lot of stress and like having
a
to
wrinkle,
deal.
a wrinkle there, a wrinkle here, sleepless night here.
Yeah, yeah. And also, I don't think I would like to talk about like problems caused by other people,
Right,
even
customers
if
or anything.
Yeah, but also it just doesn't sound like fair because it's very rarely a fault of a single person, right? And I'm sure I caused a lot of problems myself, even if I don't know about that. But I think a funny story is like how I actually got to work on Postgres or with Postgres, right? And that's like 2003 or something. And I've been working for a company which was running a couple of websites, like e-commerce sites on MySQL, and it was like having problems with like actually handling the load because the database just couldn't keep up. Obviously, the decision was to migrate to a different database, and I think at that point the management started to consider like buying Oracle licenses or something, which at that time was like quite expensive for a small company like the one I worked for. So we started exploring like different options, and Postgres came as like the database to migrate to because it was also open source. It was free. It had a lot of like interesting features that we didn't have in MySQL. We necessarily didn't need them at that moment, but it seemed like
nice to have.
a nice product. We've been trying to solve the performance issues. So that was like the number one thing, the main motivation for this. We migrated to Postgres, right? And the performance was still terrible. And then we learned that actually it's not because of the database, but mostly because of how the web application is actually written, right? Because it was like for each field, it did like separate query into the database.
Oh.
So a single page load could do, I don't know, thousands
queries.
thousands of queries, which on the hardware from like 2003 meant that like 3 people and it was like done, right? So after reworking this into a sensible coding pattern, which like you fetch the data once and then you just display them instead of like getting the IDs and then like requesting the title for the product, and, like, description for the product. Then it started working perfectly fine. But we kind of already stuck with Postgres because it seemed to perform quite well, and it was also more reliable because I do remember at that point it was still MySQL with the MyISAM without like a transaction log and everything.
Right.
So we kept having random problems because of data corruption somewhere. And with Postgres, that wasn't the case anymore.
I still remember the errors from MySQL. MySQL has gone away. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
It was just randomly appearing MySQL has gone away. I was like, oh my God, where did it go? What's happening now? And yeah, I'm happy that your accident also bring you to Postgres in a way that was like a plot twist to the story.
Yes. It was kind of like interesting way to learn about like how not to do web applications.
Right. Well, I'm sure like you experience many more things, and I know you're also active in the higher support levels in the company. So I think there's no end to learning disastrous things, and I hope we will not encounter that many in our lifetime. Okay. Yeah. How can people find you? I know that your blog is blog.pgaddict.com. People can find
actually
or not.
I haven't really blogged there for a long time. I'm just starting to preparing a new blog.
Okay.
I will probably. I think the easiest way for people to find me is either to go on my GitHub account,
which is T Vondra for people wondering. GitHub.com T Vondra. Okay.
or just to search in the Postgres mailing list and
Hackers list.
and send an email there. Or actually, I do have an email, tomas.vondra@postgresql.org, which is like my committer email. So people can just contact me there. Yes.
Perfect. Thank you, Tomas, for your time and for sharing all of these with us. And it was a delight to talk to you.
It was great to have a chat. And if there's anyone listening and thinking about like maybe starting to contribute to Postgres or like doing the first batch and they need some help with that, just feel free to get in touch. And we can have a chat. I can offer a couple ideas for first batches, and then I can help you with getting it through. I can't obviously promise that it will get committed, but I can help you with doing as much as possible to make it possible.
That's amazing. That's a great opportunity, I think, in my opinion. And thank you for doing that for community as well to grow. And if anybody's listening podcast from Prague, we will start the meetups. And if you have any ideas and if you just want to talk to or just join us in or around Prague or neighboring countries, feel free to write us as well. Okay, then thank you so much and we'll talk to you again. Bye-bye.
Bye.